So this morning I want to kind of put before you something that maybe feels counterintuitive, but hopefully you'll also see ultimately as relevant. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to receive a gift. So I think one of the questions that's probably one of the most common questions that we ask, whether we use these words or not, is how do we fix this? Like when we are looking at the news and we hear about the war in Ukraine and the Middle East, or we think about the political process, do we just kind of look at this and go, how do we fix this? Or sometimes if we're looking at ourselves, we want to be better friends or a better spouse or a better father, and yet we keep on making the same mistakes, and we look at ourselves and we go, how do I fix this? Or at an even subtler level, oftentimes not conscious, there is an awareness in us, I think, that we were meant to have a relationship with God that we don't. That there is a distance with Him that is not right, and a part of us asks, how do I fix that? And the Bible actually has a word that's kind of the word that describes what we are looking for when we're asking that question. The word righteousness is what the goal is when we're saying, how do I fix this? Righteousness is things being made right. Righteousness is the word the Bible uses to speak of the world being made right, where there is no more war, no more disharmony, confusion, dissension, all is good. That's righteousness. Righteousness is the word that is used to describe us when we are the way we are meant to be, the more loving and wise and true version of ourselves. That's righteousness. And perhaps above all else, righteousness is the word that is used to describe the relationship we are meant to have with God. Without any guilt, without any alienation, being right with God, that is righteousness. That's what we're asking for when we say, how do we fix this? And the Christian gospel answers our question when we ask, how do we fix this? It says, you can't. Our problem is just too deep. The mistakes we've made, the ways that we've done things to ourselves has gone so far that it is truly not in our power to attain that righteousness that we're longing for. But importantly, the Christian gospel says something more. It says, and you don't have to. Because that righteousness that you are longing for and seeking is offered to you as a gift. That when God gave Jesus into this world, when Jesus gave his life to die and rise again, it was to give you a rightness with God so that all of your guilt, all of your shame is removed. And as he brings you into relationship, this righteousness is also given to you so that as you come to know God and experience his love, you begin to be made whole and more loving and wiser. And what's promised is also this death and resurrection of Jesus is at work in such a way that in the very end, this world will be made beautiful and all will be right. The Christian gospel is the righteousness that we long for, that we could never achieve, is now offered to us as a gift to be taken hold of by faith. And this is the very heart of what Paul is talking about in Romans. And when Paul is writing this letter, it's been roughly 3 decades since that news first came to people as Jesus died and rose again. And throughout these decades, that news has been spreading throughout the Roman Empire. As people become Christians, they become so excited about it that as they move around, they tell other people. And they tell, in every town they go to, there's kind of these 2 stages or 2 groups of people that hear about it. There are the Jews and there are the Gentiles. It starts usually with the Jews in the synagogues, because the Jews have the Bible, the Old Testament, and this Old Testament has told them, God has promised, not only he has told them this is the way of righteousness, but he has said, and I will bring my righteousness to you. So for centuries, the people of Israel, the Jews, have been prepared for this moment when God gives his righteousness. And so people go to the synagogues and say, it's happening. God has fulfilled his promises. But it doesn't stop there, because this gift, we are told, is not just for Jews, but for everyone. And so it spills out, and Gentiles, whether Persians or Romans or Greeks, anyone who's not a Jew, hears about this. This is not something that Gentiles have been waiting for. They have not known the true God. They have not been waiting for God to do something. They might have some inkling of a need for a meaningful life or trying to figure out what it looks like to live well, but it's not something they've been looking for, and yet they hear the news as well. God's righteousness is a gift that's come to you through Jesus. And so this news of the gift has spread. And if you didn't know what happened, if you weren't aware of early church history, and if you think about this spreading in these two groups, you might predict that amongst these two groups, one will receive this news with joy, and the other won't. And you'd be right. But you might get it wrong as to which one actually receives it. This is where our passage begins. Verse 30 in our passage, Paul says, what do we say there? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. So, what we know from Acts and from early church history is exactly this, that as this news, this gospel spreads from town to town, surprisingly, Gentiles in droves come to believe in this. People who had never even known anything about the Old Testament God, as they hear this good news of a gift of righteousness offered in Jesus, they believe and are changed. And yet, as it goes from synagogue to synagogue to synagogue, very few people amongst the Jews take hold of this. It's not no one. Paul is an example, of course, as a Jew who takes hold. But by and large, the Jewish people who have been waiting for centuries for this to happen do not take hold of it. Why? That, of course, is the question that Paul asks in verse 32. Literally, why? And what we'll see is, because sometimes the hardest thing for a person to do is to receive the gift. Verse 32, why? Because they, that is Israel, did not pursue righteousness by faith, which is about receiving, but as if it were based on works, which is about achieving. The giftness of this was what stood in the way. Or again, 10 verse 3 says something very similar. For, again, this is talking about the people of Israel, being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own. Do you hear that? This was something they were trying to accomplish. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law, and we know they did not receive Christ. There's an interesting word in 10 verse 3 that's talking about this dynamic. They did not submit to God's righteousness. There is something about a gift that demands a response. It demands a certain kind of acceptance that also involves a certain kind of releasing. So if you can just imagine, to use the metaphor, if you're given this gigantic gift and you are supposed to take in your arms, whatever else you're holding in your arms, you have to put down to take hold of this gift. And in a similar way, if God is giving a transformed life and a transformed relationship with Him, a gift so extraordinary requires someone first to let go of the broken life of autonomy and personal control, to let go of that so that they can accept and receive this glorious gift that God wants to give of righteousness. And what we see with the Gentiles is, I think oftentimes you have people who had come to an end of themselves, who had recognized that their life was not something that they desired to hold on to. And so when this news of a gift, of something so glorious, they would just throw away what they had before and say, yes, I want this, and take hold of it. But for the people of Israel, all of their lives had been spent on this project to be good enough, to be in fact better than the rest of the world, to earn God's approval. That had become their identity. And so that very pursuit of doing what was right was something that they would not be willing to let go of, to take hold of what was far better, God's gift of righteousness. Sometimes the hardest thing for a person to do is to receive a gift. I was trying to think of how to illustrate it, and the story, Victor Hugo's classic Les Miserables, came to mind, also, of course, made famous by the Broadway musical. Near the very heart of the story are two characters who illustrate what we're talking about, Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert. Both of them are born into poverty and experience the cruel things of this world, and both of them, at a certain point, encounter grace. Valjean, if you know the story, you know he's imprisoned as an orphan child for stealing bread. He is part of this brutal life in prison for years, being treated as a subhuman, and he learns from that this world is cruel and impersonal, and the only way to survive is just to take, and it doesn't matter who you hurt in the process. And so when he leaves the prison and goes around, no one will look at him, no one will give him a job because he's an ex-con, but to his surprise, one day, this priest welcomes him in, doesn't make him pay for anything, brings him to the table and gives him this nice meal with the finest of silver, allows him to experience a comfortable bed, and he experiences this welcome that he doesn't understand. But Valjean wakes up in the middle of the night, and it occurs to him that this trust that this priest has shown him is an opportunity for him to take. And so he creeps out of his room, he finds the silver that had been used to give him hospitality, and he takes it all, and he leaves quickly from the house. And not that long after, police find him, see him as a thief, and bring him back to the priest. And so the priest is early in the morning, wakes up, comes out the door, and he sees Valjean, he sees the police, he sees the silver, and he understands what's happened. And he tells the police, this is a misunderstanding. I gave him this silver. And Valjean, you left so quickly that you forgot these silver candlesticks. You didn't take those as well. The police leave, assuming Valjean is innocent. And Valjean is speechless. He does not have a category for what he's experiencing this moment. He, through the priest's kindness, has experienced the grace of God. And he realizes at that moment that he has a decision before him. If he is going to receive this gift, everything is going to have to change. In the musical, he sings these words, "He told me that I have a soul." How does he know? What spirit comes to move my life? Is there another way to go? I am reaching, but I fall, and the night is closing in, and I stare into the void, to the whirlpool of my sin. I'll escape now from that world, from the world of Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean is nothing now. Another story must begin. And so it does. He leaves that moment having released his former life and taking hold of a new, transformed life, and he is a changed man, changed by grace. Now, Inspector Javert also, as I said, starts in a place of darkness. He's actually born into the prison, but he has organized his life around a different principle. Rather than seeing it all about taking, he has decided that though the world might feel cold, it is just. And if you experience bad things, it's because you've done bad things. And if you want to experience a good life, you just have to be good. His motto at one point, he says, honest work and reward, that's the way to serve the Lord. And so he dedicates his life to honest work. He becomes an inspector of the law, meant to bring about justice. His entire life is organized around being morally scrupulous, because if he lives well, good things will happen. That's how it works. And so much of the story, he is pursuing Valjean, who has cast off his parole to start a new life, because he sees Valjean no other way except as an enemy, as someone who is wrong. But then Inspector Javert also encounters grace. He is taken captive by some revolutionaries, And because he is someone who represents the state, he is almost certainly going to die. But Valjean is among that group, and Valjean recognizes Javert, the one who has been trying to kill him for all this time. And in a moment where no one else is looking, Valjean helps Javert to escape. And so then Javert later on, as he is now alive, safe and free, is speechless. He does not have a category for what he has just experienced. He has experienced through Valjean's kindness an expression of God's grace. And if that is real, then he cannot any longer hold on to the way he saw the world before. And so he too, in the musical, has a moment similar where he says, "And must I now begin to doubt? Who never doubted all these years? My heart is stone and still it trembles. The world I have known is lost in shadow. I am reaching, but I fall. And the stars are black and cold as I stare into the void of a world that cannot hold. I'll escape now from that world, from the world of Jean Valjean." And he dies. He throws himself off the bridge because he cannot any longer accept a world like this. He can't receive this gift of grace because he can't let go of the entire project that he had embarked upon before. Sometimes the single hardest thing to do is to receive a gift. So what's my point? This passage doesn't just speak to a first century situation of Jews and Gentiles, and of course it's not just talking about 19th century Frenchmen. This passage, I would suggest, is speaking to you and to me right now. See, anytime this news is heard, anytime we hear from the Bible a description of God's righteousness given to us, like is happening in this very moment, God is offering to you and to me a gift. And we are brought to a place of decision. Are we willing to let go whatever it is we have in our hands, the control that we have so tightly been grasping, so that we are willing to take hold of God's gift of righteousness for us? You know, one of the great surprises I think our passage has for us is that the people who are the most moral, the people who are the most committed to doing what is right, are often the people who are most resistant to the actual gospel. They are often the people who are actually furthest away from becoming a Christian, because they are so committed to the project of making themselves right that they cannot recognize that God has something better for them, that if only they will let go of this project of trying to be better, they will receive something far greater. That is the story of Javert. That is the story, we are told, of many from Israel. And I wonder if that is the story of any here. You know, in a typical church, there often are a few people in any congregation that will have come to think that being a Christian is largely about trying to be a good enough person for God. That being a Christian is just about trying to be honest, going to church, making sure you say your prayers, give generously, doing things and hoping that you've done enough that at the very end of your life, God will decide you're okay enough to be received into heaven. And I wonder if I'm describing any of you. If that is you, I would like to ask you to consider something very simple. That God has something far better for you than that. That you will never do it. You will never be able to make yourself good enough. You will never be able to fix your relationship with God on your own, and you don't have to. Because God, in love, wants to embrace you and give you that which you could never do on your own. You just need to be willing to let go of this project of being good enough on your own and receive this gift. But also I've noticed in a typical church there are usually some in the congregation who will come to kind of a different conclusion, who will say, I could never become a Christian. Maybe it's because you have done something that you just feel like disqualifies you. Or maybe it's the kind of person you are. I'm just so filled with doubts, I'm so confused, my life is such a mess. It would be impossible for me to be a Christian. And if I'm describing you right now, I want you to consider this. You are making the very same mistake as the other group I just mentioned. You're absolutely right. You could never do this. You could never fix things on your own. You can never make yourself right before God, and you do not have to. It does not matter who you are. It does not matter what you have done. It is not meant to be something you achieve. It is a gift that God wants to give you his righteousness, to make you right. The question is just, are you willing to let go of whatever you've been holding on to so that you can take hold of this gift? Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to take hold of a gift. So what does that mean? What does it look like to receive God's gift of righteousness? Well, there's a good way and a bad way of trying to receive God's gifts. Let me first tell you what it's not. And maybe, have you ever experienced when you give someone something and you sense that when you've given them a gift, they feel like it's a debt, like they have to do something to pay you back? That's not really how to receive a gift, is it? There's this movie that many of us have seen, Saving Private Ryan. And if you don't know the movie, it's a story about a captain and a troop of soldiers who are sent behind enemy lines to save one man, Private James Ryan, and to bring him back safely. And it goes, in many ways, horribly. There is so much brutality. Many of the soldiers die, but they finally find James Ryan. And shortly before he's rescued, the captain himself is shot, and as he's bleeding onto the ground, dying, he draws James Ryan near him, and he whispers to him, "Earn this. Earn this." In other words, we have given so much to save you. Now make it worth it. And the movie, at the very end, you see now James Ryan, now much older, visiting the grave of the captain, and he says, "There is not a day that has gone by where I have not heard those words, and I've tried my best, and I hope it's enough." And I think that sometimes when we hear this idea of God giving us a gift, this is what we actually hear. Jesus dying for us and says, "Look at what I've done for you. Now earn this." You could never, ever, ever earn what Jesus has done. And he will never, and he has never asked you to earn it. What Jesus does as he gives himself, what God says as he gives this gift, is simply receive this. Receive this gift of love. How? Well, that's really where the second half of our passage takes us. And we won't go through all of the details. Paul kind of gives some steps, but verse 17 is a fairly good starting place, where we're told, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. How do we receive the gift? It starts with hearing. Whenever, like right now, this gospel is spoken about, it begins with hearing. Not just like hearing the words in our ears, although obviously that's needed. Have you ever been in an argument where both sides, and you know that you're just so focused on making sure the other person has to hear you, and they're so focused on trying to make sure that you hear them, but something happens where maybe one person back downs, and suddenly the defenses drop down, and for the first time you're actually listening, and you start feeling and experiencing what the other person is saying. That's hearing. And that's how this begins. When God says, I love you, I've given Jesus for you, I'm offering my righteousness to you, it begins with the defenses dropping down and us being willing to taste and experience the reality of this. That's how receiving starts. Verse 17 says, faith comes from hearing. That is the next part. From hearing, receiving moves to faith. Faith isn't just something that happens to you. This is a common misunderstanding. Faith involves a choice to trust. If someone tells you, I love you, you don't have to believe them, right? You can decide, because it's safer to not trust anyone, to hold them at arm's length and to wait until it's absolutely certain, which it will never be. But as long as you're that way, you will never experience the joy of fellowship with another person. When you hear those words, you receive them by trusting, and you are connected to the other person. And in the same way, to receive the gift from God, when he declares these things as we hear, it involves being willing to let go of the control and the safety that comes through indifference and trusting. Even amidst confusion, even amidst doubt, we receive the gift by choosing to trust. We receive by hearing, we receive by believing. And then if you kind of trace backwards that list that begins in verse 14, we see that those who have faith then turn to God and call out to him. This, in some ways, is the culmination of receiving the gift. It is calling on the name of the Lord. To call on God is really the fundamental action of faith, because it is the opposite of the way we were before. Before we were saying, it's up to me, it's all on me. When we call out to God and saying, it's up to you, I now depend on you. Lord God, you promised to give this gift. I need it. I need your righteousness. I need your forgiveness. I need you to lead me. That is what it looks like to call on the name of the Lord. And that is how we receive the gift. If you want to know what it means to become a Christian, this is how. It's hearing this gospel. It's believing it. It's calling on the name of the Lord. If you want to know what it looks like to be a Christian day in, day out, it's the same thing. Every day, we once again choose to hear this news. We place our trust in it, and day in and day out, the Christian learns to call on God as the one who is for us. And with this instruction of what it looks like to receive the gift, there is an extraordinarily precious promise. Did you see it back in verse 13? Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Do you see the qualification here? It's not all those who live an especially good life will be saved. No, it's everyone who calls on the name. It's to call on the name of the Lord. And notice it's also not the especially heartfelt and devoted and faithful people who call on the name of the Lord. No, it is everyone. It's the hesitant, the doubting, the confused, the half-hearted, the weak-willed, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord in helplessness, saying, Lord, help me, will receive this gift and experience salvation. Do you hear how beautiful that is? We long to see things made right. We long to have things fixed, and we can't do it. But God says, I will make you right. I will make you forgiven and loved by me. I am going to make the world right. Here is my gift. hear him? Will you let go of your control and trust him? Will you relinquish your self-sufficiency and call on his name? I invite you to do that with me right now, silently. Every time we turn to God after we hear his word, and what we are ultimately doing is calling on him. We're acknowledging our sins, we're acknowledging our weakness, and we're saying, Lord, I need you, please help me. And I invite you, in the quiet of your hearts, to spend some time doing that, and then I'll lead us in prayer in a minute's time. So would you please join with me in prayer?